Pope John the 23rd is central to this entire discussion. He was actually a foot soldier in the Italian army in World War I. As a Vatican diplomat, he worked in Bulgaria and in Turkey. There have been rabbis who have credited him with saving the lives of Jews during the Holocaust. So we have this aftermath of World War II and the Shoah, and we have the founding of Israel in 1948. This begins to press upon lots of people, not just simply Catholics, a kind of a time for reconsideration and a reaffirmation. Now, I read, and I wasn't aware of this until more recently, there was a French rabbi, Jules Isaac, who went to the Pope and said, listen, you've been through this, you know what Jews have done and what how we have suffered. But as far as I can see in the Second Vatican Council, they're not going to address this question of anti-Judaism, to be polite, about that in the Catholic Church. He was moved by this. And he said, no, we are going to address it. So I think it's a combination of the big macro events of the Holocaust and the founding of Israel and a reconceptualization of the Catholic Church's role in the modern world, as well as a more proximate case here with Rabbi Jules Isaac touching the Pope, saying, let's go with this. And I think all these things came together. The Protestant community was very welcoming to this, although in some cases, maybe you're not so certain about mentioning Hindu and Islam and Buddhist. They wanted to keep it more Christian, whereas the Pope decided that this has to take a larger cast. And of course, it was up to Paul VI then to come in and actually promulgate. So I think there's a confluence of events that came together, both personal and historical. Well, I think to some extent, in all honesty, Nostra Aetate got somewhat eclipsed in the minds of many Catholics at the time, not today. Today, I think it's gotten the significance it deserved back then. Quite frankly, as a young Catholic at the time, we were impressed by a lot of the changes that were going on. Some of them were just symbolic, such as no meat on Friday, but the nuns losing their habit and a lot of changes going on which were unsettling to a lot of Catholics. That, quite frankly, was something that overrode some of these other concerns. Now, the issue that we're talking about is more important in the larger realm of things, but I remember back at that time, there was a state of confusion, and still is to some extent with Catholics, about sometimes the changes came on too quickly. We could argue forever whether it was the spirit of Vatican II, whether it was the actual 16 documents, or whatever. But here's where it means so much to me, is that this was basically the clearest exposition of the Catholic denunciation of anti-Semitism. And I'm very proud of the fact that on December the 10th of 2015, the 50th anniversary, it was even more explicit. Now we're being told that we have to fight anti-Semitism. It is not good enough to say that supersessionism is nonsense. The covenant has never been revoked. We know that. As Francis has said, you can't be a Christian and be an anti-Semite. If you are, you're a hypocrite, you're a liar. There's no place for you in the Christian world. That needs to be said over and over again. I think so what's happened in 2015 in the 50th year celebration even punctuates beyond what happened in 1965. So I think it's a moment for Catholics. I find very few Catholics today who have any problem with it. I say back then in the 60s, they didn't really have that kind of conversation, at least in the young circles that I dealt with at that time. But most Catholics today, of course, are very proud of it. I remember going to an ADL dinner in honor of John Cardinal O'Connor here a number of years ago. And this was the centerpiece of the discussion, and how Nostra Aetate opened the doors and the eyes of Catholics who perhaps themselves were, I'm not saying they were guilty per se of anti-Semitism. I don't think they were alert to it. I don't think they were sensitive to it. And while Nazism, as Ed Koch said, is what was responsible for the Holocaust, there's an anti-Judaic element there in Catholicism which had to be addressed. And wherever you find any kind of expression of bigotry, it has to be condemned by any reasonable person, and certainly by the Catholic Church, beginning at the hierarchy. As I say, when you're a traditionalist institution like the Catholic Church or the military, you should be open to reform. But when it comes too quickly, it can be convulsive. Now, in the situation here, the relationship with Jews, I wouldn't say it was convulsive. I don't think that most Catholics, certainly when I went to Catholic school, we weren't taught to hate Jews. I don't know that we were as sensitive to the plight of Jews historically with Catholic contributions. That wasn't addressed. but it would be I don't want to leave the impression that there's some kind of a cataclysmic break that took place and that everybody said, oh my God, we have to change. It was back in the 2nd century that one of the theologians in the church argued that the old covenant means nothing. It's invalid. The church fathers branded him, Marcion of Samos, as a heretic. So there is that element there, which I don't think enough Catholics are aware of as well. Even going back to the 2nd century, the idea that the old covenant is something that we shouldn't respect and is invalid is not part of Catholic teaching. That's been true for a long time. But again, given what happened with the Holocaust and then the founding of Israel, and then of course it's not just with these two popes. We have St. John Paul II, first to visit a synagogue. Here's a man who went to Auschwitz, who dealt with Jews as a young man when he was single himself, and has been followed through with Benedict, very sensitive to him, and with Pope Francis. There are differences between all these popes, John the 23rd and Paul the 6th and St. John Paul and Benedict and Francis, but the one continuing thread is this relationship with Jews. And I don't see that ever changing. I mean, I'm not a seer. I don't see that's too ingrained. That's now baked in. It's caked into Catholic theology, and it has now reached a younger audience. So the younger audience regards this as being passé. Of course, Catholics should have good relations with Jews and condemn anti-Semitism. So I think it's one of the great success stories in my lifetime. It's usually on the fringes where you see this. For example, in Protestant circles, some of the extremely Orthodox circles, that's where you'll see this reflection of supersessionism, which to Catholics, replacement theology is nonsense. And that was restated again on December the 10th of 2015, the 50th anniversary. But so I don't even think it has a role with us. There are some extreme Catholic groups, but they tend not to even be recognized by the church that are on the right, the super Orthodox ones. Quite frankly, I think they're loopy. But in evangelical circles, there is a slice, a segment there that's unfortunately a bigger problem there than it is when we have these people in the Catholic community. So you've got to deal with that. That's a theological impetus. That's a theological bias, a theological flaw. You don't understand Christianity without the Old Covenant. It's impossible. As Richard John Neuhaus once said, we have to be concerned and appreciate the vocation of Abraham. That's what we're all about, to see the bond between the two. Now, on the left, yes, Presbyterian Church has a horrible record in dealing with the BDS movement. The Church of Christ, unfortunately, the Quakers, American Friends, also are there. But the biggest problem is, and in fairness to Protestants, most mainline Protestants I don't think have really gone there, but there's a leaning that way. You won't see support, I'm proud to say as a Catholic, of this boycott, divestment, and sanction movement in Catholic circles. If it exists, it certainly escaped me. Unfortunately, you can see it rooted in the Presbyterian Church and some other smaller denominations. But on the college campuses, it's hot. It's big out in California, University of California. Remember, all this started with Durban back in 2001 in South Africa fighting racism. Well, Zionism is racism? No. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who's a distant relative of mine, I understand. I had little fights with him on abortion. But he was a good man. He was at the UN. And he called him out on that. Zionism is not racism. Zionism is the quest for Jews going back to Herzl for their own homeland. We understand that. But there's a left-wing fringe here, which is more of a threat than some people on the right who have these theological problems, because they're pretty well self-contained. They're somewhat insular. The ones on the left are not insular. And they receive the support of a lot of elite people in the dominant culture, particularly at the university level. We've seen it here at Vassar. We've seen it at Bard College. We've seen it at most of the University of California has one way or another been involved in this kind of situation. We understand Palestinians and their rights and their needs. But to single out Israel, which is the only democracy in the Middle East, to single out Israel for punishment and trying to go after Hewlett-Packard and Caterpillar and try to gut their whole divestments from these people is shameless. If it wasn't for the Jews in Israel, there wouldn't be any talk of freedom and liberty in that area of the world. This is an expression of the left-wing disdain for Western civilization, for North America, and that's where it's coming from. And it's also coming from a lot of secular circles, and sometimes showing up here and there, even the New York Times, which certainly should be doing a better job in condemning the BDS movement, and I dare say so should others. This thing will continue to grow and fester unless it's checked, and responsible Catholics need to speak out more about it. But there's an intimidation here. When you get the secular dominant elites, led by some of the media, certainly in the academy and higher education, it does have a way of silencing people. But these people are censors and they're bullies, and they need to be defeated. While the Catholic millennials certainly can be given a pass for not contributing to the BDS movement, they can also be faulted for not speaking out against it. So it's not good enough to say, well, we're not contributing to that. A passive voice in the face of this injustice has to be condemned. And I think it really is up to the bishops to speak to the campus ministers, including those outside the Catholic schools. You have Cardinal Newman societies, and you have all kinds of other campus reform groups that are available on the state university. But just take the 300 or so Catholic, 230 or so Catholic colleges and universities. I don't see enough happening there on this. And if I had to, I'm going to go down a little bit on a limb here. I've been known to do that once in a while. If I had a reason as to why that is, the Catholic Church, somewhat simplistic, but in terms of public policy and civic causes, you do have a pro-life segment and a social justice segment. The social justice is committed to the poor. The pro-life, opposed to euthanasia, abortion, and the like. Unfortunately, they tend to divide. They tend not to be conflated and come together. Now, when you talk about social justice, all right, that has been code for more left politics. They would be the people who should address the BDS movement, but while I don't think Catholics are rallying to the side of the BDS movement, I think that that segment of the Catholic population, namely the left activist segment, has friends and associates in the BDS movement, which stops them from taking the role that I think they should take. Now, so I think the social justice people are somewhat compromised, quite frankly. That doesn't explain, though, why the pro-life people can't. And sometimes they can be very insular as well. I mean, to get out of their little cocoon, I mean, I'm certainly all in favor of life begins at conception to natural death. We understand that. But where you have a situation like this as a civil rights, the BDS movement has to be stopped. And you can't just throw it on Jews to do it. It has to come from people of goodwill who understand the bigotry that's being exhibited there. Much of it, I'm not saying all of it, is a clear expression of anti-Semitism. It may be couched differently. It takes a different genre of form here because it's looked upon as, well, we're fighting against injustice, so how can you be against us? No. When you single out the one democracy in the Middle East for punitive sanctions, don't tell me that you're the friend of Israel. Don't tell me there isn't at least a trace of anti-Semitism at work. I've been around too long to see that. I know it is. This idea that Jews killed Christ, I'm always reminded of my friend Ed Koch. He said, no, that'd be like saying that it was Catholics who killed the Jews. He said, no, because Hitler was raised a Catholic, and then, of course, he became an apostate and an atheist. But Nazis killed Jews. You have to understand what we're talking about here now. There are some very ignorant people, and we shouldn't be afraid of calling them ignorant, because there's no evidence whatsoever to make a sweeping condemnation of Jews because there were some high priests who didn't accept the visitation of Mary. Now, all of a sudden, all Jews throughout the history of the world are responsible with their hands bloody? This is insanity. But unfortunately, it wasn't checked the way it should have been by a lot of the church fathers throughout the Catholic Church's history. I don't know of anybody, and I run in lots of different circles, who even entertains this idea today. As a matter of fact, I think it's been so well shut down as something which is totally nonsensical, at least in Catholic quarters, that nobody's going to mention it. And I run in circles where people are free to say whatever they want about different peoples. That's one thing. The idea, this deicide notion that Jews are responsible for the killing of Christ is scurrilous, it's pernicious, it's invidious. It has to be condemned by every reasonable person. And thank God we've made a lot of progress on that. Again, though, it shouldn't take until the 20th century before we make it that formal. But now that it's out there, and as I say, back in 2015, when they reaffirmed Nostra Aetate, they came out and they said, again, you have to combat anti-Semitism. It's not good enough to say the Jews weren't responsible. We got to take the next step out there, which is why I get involved with my Jewish friends here in New York City. When you have characterizations of Jews in plays at Lincoln Center, Leon Klinghoffer, I was glad to be there and to speak about that situation, as many other rallies with Israel. You're not going to win this war for justice if everybody stays in their own little community. You've got to transcend. You've got to get out there and make friends with others out there. You don't have to agree with them on everything. You've got to agree on certain principles and on certain causes. And then there should be reciprocity, of course. My experience in New York is it's one of those few cities in the country where there's not a big Protestant presence, or for that matter, even a big Muslim presence or Mormon presence. It's largely Catholic and Jews. They're the vast majority of New Yorkers. So as a Catholic leader, I've been involved with a lot of different causes to help out Jews, and I've gotten the response back. Right down the block from here at the Empire State Building, we were fighting for Mother Teresa because they wouldn't light up the tower blue and white on her centenary back in April of 2010. The first person speaking was Jackie Mason, my friend, all right, and Beth Galinsky and other Jews who were there, as well as the late Stephen McDonald and many others who spoke there. And I had Buddhist, and I had Hindu, and I had Muslims, and I had Albanians representing Mother Teresa. That's the way it should be done. And again, back to the BDS movement, because that's gone beyond theological circles. It's gone beyond any kind of fringe group. It's hit the mainline elites in the academy and in the media, in the entertainment business. And unless people speak out, that's going to grow. I am not at all satisfied with the way that has been checked. It hasn't been checked the way it should be. I want to talk about the deicide issue, the idea that all Jews are responsible for the death of Christ. This is madness. It's insanity. Fortunately, I don't know of a single Catholic, and I travel in a lot of different circles, who entertains this kind of idea. Having said that, we still need to condemn it, because there are people out there who still believe this kind of nonsense. And at one time, I think it was more prevalent in the past. The idea that you can collectivize guilt because there are some Catholics, for example, who have done some bad things, therefore all Catholics are responsible. It reminds me of the idea that, you've had less than 5% of the priests who've been involved in pedophilia. Somehow all priests are somehow pedophiles. If I'm going to reject that kind of a sweeping generalization, I must reject the idea that Jews are responsible for the killing of Christ. And then even more insane is to fast forward to 2017, that somehow Jews are responsible for the killing. This kind of madness needs to be condemned, and it shouldn't be entertained any more rationally than to entertain the idea of the Flat Earth Society. Nostra Aetate very explicitly rejected this idea of the collectivization of guilt, that somehow Jews were all responsible for the killing of Christ then, and then fast forward into 2017. So, but even beyond that, I think it's been taught today in the Catholic schools and elsewhere that this idea is insane, that it's palpably unjust to collectivize the guilt. And Nostra Aetate was the springboard for that. It clarified what had been understood in the past, and today I'm very proud of the fact that that's gone into the vector of change has gone even beyond that. Today, you'd have to be really a marginalized Catholic to entertain that kind of insanity. It's one thing if you say that we have a hate group out there, which is against Catholics, Jews, Muslims, whoever it might be. If they're contained, if we know who they are, give you a quick example, the Ku Klux Klan, okay? The good news is this: there's so few of them, they are contained, they are insular, they're not a threat to the United States. They were at one time. But the problem with the BDS movement is different. They do receive at least cover, if not a kind of an acquiescence on the part of some of the mainline religions, And I'm talking about Presbyterianism. The Methodists have been struggling with this as well at a smaller level of the United Church of Christ. So yes, to the extent that you have a receptive, welcoming voice here to those people who are the enemies of Israel, and let's face it, that's what we're talking about here. They may use the boycott, divestment, sanction movement as their expression, but they are anti-Semites. They are anti-Israel. And they're using this, trying to cloak it in a veneer of justification because there might be some bad things that have happened on the part of Jews to Palestinians. Now you're going to use that as cover? And this is the problem with some of the mainline denominations. They have not addressed this. I don't see it getting much better. And I know it's kind of tricky for Catholics, including the bishops. You don't want to have bad relations with Protestants any more than you do with Jews and Muslims. On the other hand, when you see injustice stemming from the heart of the mainline Protestant denominations, it goes to this point too. Look how secular they've become. The mainline Protestant denominations are in free fall. They have been in free fall for decades. They're losing members because their theology becomes somewhat reflective of the ideology of the dominant culture. And when you lose that sense of uniqueness, why would people want to join? Catholic Church is doing okay. We've had better years. And to a large extent, because of Hispanics, Catholics coming into the church, we've been able to hold our numbers. But you see, the Orthodox amongst the Jews are doing better than the Reform. You see the evangelicals in the Protestant community doing better than the mainline. And you see that the people who support the Catholic Church on a regular basis, the one who pays the bills, the ones who actually go to church, not just at Christmas and Easter and take up a seat, but the ones that are there every Sunday, they tend to be more traditional. I mean, we just had an election where 53% of Catholics voted for Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton. That was a surprise in many quarters. Now, I'm not here to support Trump. I'm just simply saying there's an indication here on the part of Catholics things are not exactly right here, and we got to break with the past on some of these issues. Well, the good news is that in the second century, this heretic, Marcion, was labeled as such. He's trying to say that the Old Covenant is nonsense, that it's invalid, that we should just simply dispense with it. He was entertaining what we would now call supersessionism, the idea of replacement, that we have the New Testament and then we can just discard the Old Testament. The good news is that he was condemned as a heretic in the second century by the Church Fathers. The bad news is most Catholics are unaware of it. And certainly throughout the ages, as you get into the Middle Ages and into the more modern times, most Catholics are unaware of this. It needs to be restated. That's where Nostra Aetate is so important. I'm not saying that it was glacial news in one sense, but it crystallized. It took what knowing, reasonable Catholics, thoughtful Catholics knew was wrong all along, anti-Semitism, and it made it formal. And it did it in the context of Vatican II, and of course it's become ever more popular since that time, and I'm proud of what's happened. But you go back in church history, you will find these heretics out there, and you'll still see people today, including some Catholics who may get on the internet, which has unfortunately become the Wild Wild West. And some of these people out there, they claim to represent all these Catholics. The good news is they don't. But you do have some real nut jobs out there, some real wing nuts out there trying to maintain that somehow there's this Old Testament which should be discounted. There's no Old Covenant, it needs to be revoked. As Pope Francis has said, you can't be a Christian and be an anti-Semite. The Old Covenant was never revoked. And the church has made that explicit and should do so with more regularity. You know, one of the great challenges to Pope Francis is that on the one hand, you want to reach out. You want to go across the aisle and show that you are a church of goodwill to people of all religions. So, and in the context of the Middle East, that would include the Palestinians, would include the Jews, would include Muslims. But you have to be careful. This is a delicate balance. You don't want to cross the line going from reaching out to people and then giving the impression that you're giving affirmation to their cause. I think that's a very delicate balance. No pope, no Catholic leader should be giving affirmation to people who have not come to terms with recognizing the legitimacy of Israel as a right to exist as a state unto itself. Unfortunately, we know of too many examples in the Palestinian community where that is simply not true. And it would behoove all church leaders to recognize that. That has to be your stop sign. At that point, you don't want to spill over into affirmation.